There we go. So yeah, I think that's no surprise. There's a lot of uncertainty. Hopefully, this little session will help you all get a clear idea of what's involved and where it's going. Okay, so yeah, today I'll be moderating, and Sarah Jane McArthur of Brodies LLP will be presenting a summary of the Scottish Heat Networks Bill and highlighting some key points for discussion. Today's format is going to focus on a panel discussion once Sarah Jane's finished with her analysis. And thanks to Charlie Drysdale of SSE, Dave Pearson of Star Renewable Energy, and Carol Aitken of Vattenfall, who's joining us over the phone, alongside Finian Parrick, Minibems CEO. You should all be visible there. You're very welcome to say hello, hi, and good morning, you all.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, morning.
I think we're just waiting on Dave, who I think he's having a bit of a problem with his broadband, so he's going to either join us in by phone later on if he's unable to connect via the internet. Okay, so for those of you who may not have joined us before with these webinars, they intend to be a weekly webinar, and the purpose of them is just get people, different people from across the heat sector, the heat network sector, to present their thinking, to have debate about different aspects of it, technical and otherwise. And the goal is really to look at any aspect that relates to the effective and efficient delivery of heat performance from design through to delivery and operation. So as many points of view are always very welcome. Yeah, and so while in previous webinars we've looked at controls, the aspect of controls within a heat network and the role of heat pumps within heat network, today we're looking at policy. So this is a different point of view in terms of what we're trying to get done. As always, for those of you who are interested in participating, obviously by attending, which we appreciate greatly, or by presenting a webinar yourselves in conjunction with us, please get in touch. If you know of any other webinars that you think that people would benefit from attending, please let us know. We like to give a shout out to them as well. This is a collaborative process, and particularly today, we really appreciate your thoughts and your questions. So you should find a question box where you can put in questions relating to anything you have, really. So just to make sure you can get those points across. If you're interested in looking at our previous webinars, search Minibems YouTube or just go on to the Minibems website. This webinar as well will be recorded and uploaded onto our website as well. And yeah, just briefly, for those of you not familiar with what Minibems does, we provide heat network performance services. We enable efficient low carbon heat networks. Our IoT, Internet of Things, connected devices provide our clients with real-time flow control, automated control strategies, and unparalleled data access. This is backed up with remote monitoring and fault finding for technical and customer support. The goal that we have is to provide unbeatable heat network performance, which results in more efficient systems, reducing primary fuel costs and related carbon emissions, enabling low carbon technologies, and improving the reliability and reducing unplanned maintenance costs associated with heat networks. Okay, so today is a one-off webinar relating to the Scottish Heat Networks Bill consultation. This is of particular urgency as the deadline for the feedback is coming on the 15th of May. So hopefully we'll have some good points that you guys can feed back into. Sarah Jane will highlight the big questions and themes being tackled by the bill. And we will follow this by a debate on a key aspect of the bill that we've sort of seen as a real talking point. And then after that, we'll have time for other questions relating to issues such as climate change, fuel poverty, equality, fairness, existing building stock versus new build, and the corresponding carrots and sticks that may be available. So pop your thoughts in the question box anytime, and we'll pick them up during the Q&A. And we'd also like to encourage you to send your thoughts to my email, and I'll collect all those thoughts and share them across all attendees and panelists. As we have access to policy makers and policy thinkers, so we'd love to be able to take the thoughts and ideas that are generated from this webinar and put them to the powers that be. And also, just if you think that some kind of follow-up workshop may be useful, then that might be something we could look at as well. Please let us know. Okay, it is over to Sarah Jane. Please take it away. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Ben. You're in control of the slides then.
Yes, indeed.
Cool. So I'm Sarah Jane McArthur. As Ben says, I'm a partner in the Energy and Infrastructure team at Brodies, and I've worked on a range of district heating projects, some that are now delivered and some that are still in development. So I've been reviewing the Heat Network Scotland bill to understand the impacts that it might have on existing and new projects, and hence Ben invited me to share some thoughts on it with you all today. The next slide then, please. So in terms of what I'm going to cover today, I will give you a brief introduction to the bill, covering what the bill is and specifically what it isn't. I will outline the key topics that are covered in the bill, and then we'll look at each topic in a bit more detail. And then, as Ben has said, there should be plenty of time for questions and discussion with the panel after that. Next slide. So I should disclose that I am an optimist, but overall, I think this legislation is a good news story. Heat network regulation is required to enable progress in the sector, and this is a step in the right direction. The bill is enabling legislation, so it sets out a framework to enable secondary legislation or regulations. So lots of the detail is still to come. Scottish Government acknowledge that frequently throughout the policy documents that accompany the bill. This isn't necessarily negative. Including the detail in secondary legislation enables flexibility, and it allows the policy to be responsive as the market develops. So effectively, Scottish Government can turn measures on and off as required. Parliamentary time's not always available to allow quick amendment of primary legislation, so if all the detail was in the bill, that could be problematic later. Devolved competence isn't, oh, sorry, I'm still on the slide before. Devolved competence is an issue in some areas. For example, consumer protection. Scottish Government have asked UK Government for devolved powers on consumer protection just for heat networks to enable them to fill this gap. In terms of the timing, the bill was introduced on the 2nd of March and is in stage 1 until the 15th of May. It should be law by the end of March 2021. All of the secondary legislation is in development now, with the first licences expected in 2023 or 2024. And as Ben says, note that the call for views is open now until 15th of May, and there will be a link included at the end of this presentation. This is regulation in an almost completely unregulated sector, so there is lots to cover, although Scottish Government have tried to align with the electricity regulations where relevant. And given what it needs to cover, the Act still feels relatively short at 85 sections and 8 parts. I'm going to try and give you a flavour in 20 minutes, so this will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So it covers the following topics, not in any particular order. On the next slide. There are licences for network operators, existing and new operators. There will be powers for those licence holders, including the network wayleave right, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. There's provision for network consents for new and for extended networks. And there's provision for network zones and permits for those zones. So these are the concessions that you may have heard about through the pre-bill policy discussions. There's provision for building assessment reports, initially only for public sector buildings, but that could be expanded. And there's also a concept of key network assets and transfer schemes, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail just to explain what that does. So we'll cover all of these topics now in a bit more detail. So next slide. So firstly, network operator licenses. The first thing just to mention before I get into the detail of licenses is that the bill creates a statutory definition of heat network. At the moment, this doesn't cover ambient loops, and Parliament are particularly interested in whether the definition of heat network is correct. So I'd encourage people to look at the definitions of heat network and feedback if they don't think it covers the right projects. Once the bill is implemented, persons supplying heat from a heat network will need to be licensed. Note that it's the supplier, not the network, that's licensed, and operating without a licence will become a criminal offence. There's power in the bill to grant exemptions from the licence requirement. However, no exemptions are introduced on the face of the bill just yet. There's also a concept of a licensing authority. This will be the Scottish ministers or some other body designated as such in the future. Scottish Government basically assume that this will be Ofgem, but the Scottish ministers, don't have powers to legislate to change Ofgem's functions, so they will need to work with BEIS on that in due course. There's also, as you would expect, a lot of associated standard licensing provisions, including a process for licence applications, including some minimum requirements, but there's a lot more detail required here, for example, the qualifications required of applicants. There's the concept of licence conditions, standard and specific, and an outline process for modifying those conditions, but all of those conditions are still to be drafted. There are also powers to modify and revoke licences and to create a register for network licences. So in terms of what's missing, well, there's lots of detail still to come through secondary legislation, and I've talked a little bit about that when I was going down the list on the left-hand side. The biggest gap here is consumer protection provisions, and this is a devolved competence issue that's acknowledged by Scottish Government. They will request devolution of consumer protection provisions for heat networks to enable them to fill this gap, but of course that may not be granted, so this could be a longer term gap. I think it's useful to contrast this position with the electricity and gas regulation, where there are clear standards for dealing with consumers. So in the context of heat networks, they'll become regulated monopolies, but there'll be no additional rights for consumers or any minimum consumer standards, and that could potentially be a big issue for consumer confidence with heat networks going forward. So it's something that needs to be resolved. Next slide. So in return for getting a licence, licence holders will get some additional powers. Those powers will include compulsory acquisition of land, the necessary way leave right, which is a right to install pipes across land where the landowner doesn't agree to grant that way leave. These will be granted by the Scottish ministers following an application process, and I will come back to that in a second. Other powers include powers to carry out surveys and access land for that purpose, and to enter land to carry out repairs or replacements. There are restrictions on the powers to the extent that they impact existing utilities, so utilities already in the ground, and there are associated provisions on landowner compensation for damage caused in exercising these rights. These powers are all quite similar to the powers granted to electricity networks under Schedules 3 and 4 of the Electricity Act 1989, if anyone's familiar with those, and they are helpful. This is more than heat network operators have had in the past. But in terms of what's missing, there's no clear permitted development rights. Expansion of heat networks will require a new heat network consent. There's also a big gap on roadworks rights. Scottish Government acknowledge this omission. These provisions have been delayed while Scottish Government engages with all the necessary road stakeholders to make sure that these provisions work properly, and the intention is for those to be introduced as an amendment to the bill at a later stage of the process through Parliament. The biggest gap here is the lack of any compulsion on building owners to connect to a network or to consume the energy from the network. And I know that we're going to have quite a lot of debate on this later. Going back to that network way leave right, what that does is enables licence holders to take a pipe right up to the curtilage of a building. However, the building owner is not obliged to connect to that pipe or to take the heat from it or to even consider doing so. and therefore the building owner is not going to be paying an upfront connection charge to cover the cost of that pipe infrastructure. Scottish Government considers that taking the pipe up to the curtilage of the building might be sufficient to encourage buildings to connect at the end of the life of their current heating system, or if the building occupant changes. And I guess the question for everyone later on will be, do we think that is sufficient? Next slide, please. The bill also introduces the concept of network consents, and consents will now be required to construct or to operate a heat network. The Scottish Ministers will be the consenting authority, and there's power reserved in the bill to grant exemptions from the need to hold consents. As for licences, there are some associated standard consent provisions, and the structure there is modelled on the Electricity Act Section 36 consent. There's an outline process for applications, power to introduce consent conditions, power to approve transfers and modify and revoke consent, and enforcement powers which are similar to planning enforcement. The heat network consent also comes with deemed planning permission, same as the Section 36 consent under the Electricity Act. So in terms of what's missing here, I can't see that existing heat networks are excluded from this requirement to hold a consent, albeit that seems to be Scottish Government's policy, so there may be some clarification required there. The detailed factors which have to be considered in order to grant a consent all have to be detailed. There are some factors included within the policy document as an indication of what might be to come. Those are listed on the slide, so I won't read them out. But full detail on the application process is still awaited, similar to the position that we're in for network licences. Those will all come through secondary regulations. Next slide, please. I just want to explain this section of the bill, network assets, the concept of key network assets. So the bill introduces this concept, and this is supposed to be everything that you need in order to operate the heat network, including land, buildings and equipment. The Scottish Ministers will prepare a schedule of key network assets for each heat network consent that's granted, and this will be negotiated for every consent. Scottish Ministers can then have the power to make transfer schemes to transfer those key network assets from one operator to a relevant person. For example, if an operator ceases to operate a network because they become insolvent or because for some other reason they're just failing to supply. The relevant person can be the Scottish Ministers, it could be a local authority, or it could be a new operator subject to them getting a heat network consent for the network. And then there are associated compensation provisions for implementing those transfer schemes. What this isn't is a supplier of last resort, although that's kind of what the legislation is trying to get to. This transfer scheme just makes it easier to transfer a heat network if the existing operator becomes insolvent or fails to supply. So if you contrast that with the situation in the electricity sector, where Ofgem run a full supplier of last resort process, in the electricity sector, suppliers don't own network infrastructure, so we don't need to worry about what assets are required to provide the supply. A single supplier of last resort process modelled on the electricity sector won't work across the entire heat sector because of the number of different project structures. However, what these powers might do is make rescue a little bit easier, although it's unclear how that kind of rescue might work if the network's fundamentally unviable. As with the other topics, there is a bit of detail still to come on this. For example, how key network assets will be recorded and what the impacts might be on the property rights of landowners who host the key network assets. Next slide, please. The bill also introduces the concept of heat network zones and permits for those zones. So this is effectively creating heat network concession areas. There are powers for local authorities and Scottish Ministers to designate and to vary heat network zones. The duty on local authorities is to consider heat network zoning every 5 years, and there are prescribed factors for local authorities to consider when designating heat network zones, such as whether renewables could be used as part of the heat network, sources of waste heat available, whether there are key anchor loads in the zone, also considering existing infrastructure available in the zone and any building assessment reports that might have been done, and we'll come on to building assessments in a minute. There are also opportunities for local authorities to work together to designate heat network zones which cross local authority boundaries. There are then powers to issue permits for exclusive operation of heat networks in the heat network zone, and there's an outline application process for that and power to revoke those permits. And there's also enforcement provisions with an associated offence for operating a heat network in a heat network zone without the corresponding heat network permit. In terms of what's missing here, the duty on local authorities can be discharged by considering one specific area and then declining to designate it a heat network zone. It isn't an area-wide duty, and it might not always result in a heat network zone being designated. It's therefore important to recognise that this should be supplemented by a statutory duty to develop local heat and energy efficiency strategies, or LHES, but that would need to be introduced through separate legislation. And as before, there's a lot of the detail still to come, for example, how long zone permits might be, the conditions that might apply to zone permits and how those might be varied, and for example, what happens if permit conditions aren't complied with. And it does seem to be that Scottish Government intend to introduce the concept of zone conditions and negotiate those through the granting of permits. There's also some clarity required on the interaction between the various parts of the bill here. So, for example, the interaction between varying the heat zone and varying the permit associated with it. Some clarity around the ability to operate heat networks in a heat network zone where no one's been awarded a permit. So what about any existing networks in the zone? And also generally the interaction of heat network licenses, consents, zones and permits. I think it's going to take a wee while for everyone to fully understand how those four aspects will interact with one another. Next slide, please. So the last topic I want to cover is building assessment reports. These provisions introduce a duty on public sector building owners to assess the potential for their buildings to be supplied by a heat network, and also the expected lifespan of their existing heating system for that building. There's a framework for the form and frequency of that assessment, and there's a power to introduce exemptions from the duty. The assessment reports, once they're done, need to be sent to the relevant local authority and the Scottish ministers. So what's missing here? Well, the duty will only initially be on the public sector, although there is the power to expand this to other, for example, commercial buildings. There's a reasonable amount of detail still to come here. It doesn't exactly specify what data is required to be provided as part of these assessments, but I'd expect that to be included in subsequent regulations and guidance. There's also no set frequency for these reports, and it's not clear exactly what the local authorities or the Scottish ministers can or must do with the data that they collect. For example, does it need to go on a database that heat network developers could access? Finally, there's no duty to act on this assessment. It does appear to be a data gathering exercise rather than something that's going to, for example, require a building owner to connect to something in the future or to consider changing their heat network, their heat system. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the key takeaways from the things we covered this morning so far. Remember, this bill is effectively a framework, so there's lots of detail still to come through secondary legislation. That means there's still lots to do, but the approach does provide flexibility. On timescales, the bill should be law by March 2021, but it may be 2023 or 24 before the full suite of measures are implemented and the first licences can be applied for. There is a lot of work still to be done, but this is still a good news story in the sense that it is a step in the right direction. Devolved competence is limiting progress in some areas, mainly consumer protection, but also the ability to designate someone like Ofgem as the preferred licensing authority. But Scottish Government are in discussions with UK Government on those topics. The biggest point that I've mentioned already, the fact that no building is compelled to take heat from a network or even to connect to a heat network. It is going to be difficult, I think, to get investment to exercise all of the infrastructure powers that have been granted to licence holders if the economic case doesn't stack up because the customers aren't there. And finally, the Scottish Parliament Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee are seeking views on the bill. The call is open until 15th May 2020 and the link is shared on the next slide. I'd encourage you all to get involved and make your views known. So the next slide basically just sets out the link for the call for views, and also just recognises, because I expect that it may come up in discussion, some of the other things that would need to be addressed outside this bill, like business rates, like planning, the local heat and energy efficiency strategy that I've mentioned, and air quality issues. But we've left those up there just in case they come up in conversation, also to recognise that we hadn't forgotten about them. They're just not something that would be addressed through the Heat Networks bill. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Sarah Jane. That's fantastic. All panelists are welcome to reappear and make themselves audible. I do believe we have Dave as well. Good, yeah, so we are a complete team. Listen, thanks very much for that. We've got a bunch of questions coming through first, but as we sort of said at the top of the session, we had a discussion and we'd like to kick off just with a sort of bit of a focused debate around the issue of whether compulsion needs to be applied to connect and or consume for heat networks, as that seems to be a very important principle in terms of actually de-risking the sector and giving real drive to deliver and deploy. So what I'd like actually is perhaps if each panel member gives just a sort of a brief thought on that issue. And starting with you, Carol, please.
Yes, by all means. Yeah, like Sarah Jane, I think that this is an important and probably a regrettable omission from the bill. As the policy was being developed with the Scottish Government, it was talked about in some detail and at some length, and an obligation to consent and to consume heat was something which was very much at the core of the de-risking strategy underpinning the policy. But when it came to the drafting of the policy memorandum and the bill itself, it seems to have disappeared. And the Scottish Government were at great pains to explain why this was, and they gave various legal arguments. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't understand them, but around competition law, and perhaps Sarah Jane can comment on that in more detail. But they've also said since that if the clever minds out there in the general public can come up with creative ways of re-establishing this obligation to connect, then they're willing to listen to those arguments. And I think that given that this is such an essential contributor to de-risking the investment in heat networks and therefore to accelerating the uptake of heat networks, it's something that we should urgently address as an industry and wider beyond the industry. And I would invite contributors to the webinar today to maybe think about the suggestions. One suggestion that has been put forward is a levy. This works in Denmark. It's if there's a heat source available to you with a pipeline up to your cartilage and you choose not to use it, then you're not obliged to, but there is a levy which is commensurate with some contribution to the standing charge for that heat network. I know some people are not keen on that idea because it looks like it's a tax, but I would put that out there just for discussion to see whether it's something that might fly with the commentators.
Okay, Dave, you'd like to give us your thoughts on that initial topic?
Yeah, I'm really glad that we've got clever folk like Sarah Jane to read through the 700 million odd pages and distill it for us. So thank you very much. I think it comes down to surety, and it's the surety of businesses making a return on investment. You know, we're very inspired by yesterday's news. Vattenfall have got a very large wind farm being built, and it's just the latest of many. Think about why that happens. It happens because an investor has put up some money. In that case, it's Greencoat Capital, and I think 320 million. Ask yourself on a scale of 0 to 10 how certain they are of getting their money back plus a reasonable margin. And I think the reasonable answer is 11 out of 10. So we have to create an 11 out of 10 condition. You know, for me, that the risks, therefore, on a sort of more mundane level, are loss of license. You have to address the fact, you know, how certain is somebody, you know, at 5 years they're not going to lose a license. They can't just take the pipes back out of the ground and move them somewhere else. I think you've got to also think about the loss of heat sales, but before that, how certain are people of having the heat sales? So you've got to be really pretty certain of at least a certain threshold volume of heat sales, and I don't think we see that. There's the value of the heat sales. We've got to be realistic that there's got to be some sort of pricing sort of commitment in both directions. You know, consumers need to know, and I tend to think of commercial consumers in the centre of cities rather than domestic, and we can work out how to make sure that there's not disadvantaged situations. But you've got to have some sort of inkling of what the reasonable price of heat is going to be. Heat networks are very different from electricity networks because you've got to have this cost of production. You pretty much know if you're owning a wind farm what the cost of production is going to be. Heat networks are very different because you've got the price of input electricity. So you have to be certain about what your price of input electricity is, and therefore the sensible thing to do is try and directly contract between an electricity generator and the heat network, and that adds a whole level of complexity in electricity purchase. You don't just plug into the grid. And then there's the cost of deployment, and that's where the minutiae of the bill takes us. You know, you need to know, is a zone in a particular city, is it going to be 10 million, 20 million, or 30 million before you get going? And that basically means having all these kinks smoothed out. So just to be slightly trite, I definitely am a fan of levies. I think the value of them, it makes me almost break into song. I drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. It might not be dry, but it won't be nearly valuable enough compared to heat sales. So make it certain that there are heat sales at a reasonable price and smooth out the cost of producing that heat. And I think we've got something really workable here. We are tantalizingly close. We just need to you know, finish off the work. My only other comment would be I really want to see this drive the quality of heat sale. This can't be another mechanism to produce fossil fuel based and emissions based heat sales. It's got to be clean heat.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah, could we have Charlie and then Finn, just in terms of your thoughts to what Carol and David said, and your own thoughts generally, please?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah Jane, for that. That was really interesting, useful to have a good summary. It's going to be hard for me to add to the really useful points that Dave and Carol have just made there. I would echo the majority of them. This is, you know, it's easy to forget. This is obviously a really exciting step, and it's great to see the Scottish Government taking an initiative in this space for our market. So, you know, we really support that step. We need to be positive about that. We're proud to have been involved in it. But you know, the key here is that fundamentally the majority of the items, as Sarah Jane's highlighted in this bill, are really there to facilitate the delivery of heat and to facilitate heat networks once they're in creation. So the challenge, do we need compulsion to connect or consume? I think that the key here is that it hasn't fully addressed that demand question. And Dave's obviously given some really good statistics there on that key question there. But the challenge here is, you know, in order to use much of this bill, we need to see the projects. We need to see the projects coming to market. And we're still, you know, not at a level playing field with much of the other options that people have in order to use heat. So what I think we need to consider out with this, and on Sarah Jane's last slide there, is potentially the other mechanisms that need to be encouraged out with the bill in order to facilitate those connections, those key demands that we require in order for this large-scale capital investment to be delivered. So, for us, I think there is definitely a question mark over whether we're really going to see the type of delivery and the type of growth in the heat networks sector that needs to happen if we're going to meet these net zero targets. I think the positive step is there, but there's still a lot of question marks to come.
Okay, Finn. Thanks, Charlie. Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
Not a huge amount to add to that, really. I suppose it's just surprising that the Scottish ministers were considering, obligation and compulsion to connect, and then withdrew it. It'd be good to understand in more detail what the concern is there, and just so that we can try to see if there are ways that can be, those concerns can be mitigated. I suppose, really, maybe that we live in, in a society that likes to have, free market. It likes to consider itself a free market economy, and so wants to give people choice. But of course, that choice is actually, long-term damaging to the opportunities for the decarbonisation of heat. So that also needs to be taken into consideration. I do know that in the Netherlands, in terms of the discussion around price and making things fair, they actually have a range within which heat network operators are allowed to charge. So it's effectively capped. And that does provide some protection. So you could have a scenario of compulsion, but you knew pretty much what you were going to pay for that heat. You could maybe, where heat is a very critical part of the of the cost of sale of a business, such as process heat, where businesses have a heat network coming alongside them, but actually heat is such a key cost component of their product. You could exclude those type of businesses, so that if they were using if they were manufacturing or something like that and using a lot of heat, they could maybe be excluded or get some other kind of support from that. But yeah, I think otherwise, as we've highlighted here, without a compulsion to connect, it lacks ambition essentially as a bill.
Okay, so there's a few thoughts for you. Anyone who's listening in and has some ideas or questions regarding compulsion, please do put your ideas forward or get in touch later, but it'd be good to hear them now and be able to put them to the panel. Catherine Cooper asks, what if the Scottish Government owns the pipe and charges operators for transportation? I think that was to do with this question. What sort of involvement is the Scottish Government meant to be having in this? And Sarah Jane, sorry, I haven't asked for your sort of point of view on that question as well.
On the compulsion to connect point? Yeah,
and also that question there. The Scottish Government, whether they're owning and charging operators for transportation. But yeah, what's your point of view on the compulsion to connect?
So I can see the arguments either way, taking a nice middle lawyery path, but I think there is a gap here when you're creating, particularly when you're creating a heat network zone. So if you create a heat network zone, you're saying this is the area that's suitable for heat networks. This is an area where we'd like to see heat networks expand, and the local authorities have decided that this is a good area to do heat networks. And then they've identified potential anchor loads. Why would you not then make those anchor loads connect up to that network? Because otherwise the suitability of that area as a heat network zone is diminished. So to me, it is a missing chunk of the bill. Scottish Government had said one of their main concerns about compulsion to connect was that it removed consumer choice and that they didn't have sufficient consumer protection powers to be able to moderate the sort of that the harm effectively of taking away consumer choice. So I wonder whether if they could align or get the powers they needed on consumer protection, whether they might be willing to take a bit more of a robust view on compulsion to connect. And in terms of the competition law point, I think that all stems from the Competition and Markets Authority actually responded to the consultation. And again, what they were basically saying was, if you have a compulsion to connect, then there's no check, if you like, on the district heating network operator. There's no requirement on them to do the best that they can do because the customers are there anyway. I'm not a competition law expert, so I can't get into the nitty-gritty of the detail, but that's probably a good thing. But I think that there's still policy that could be put around any compulsion to connect that might satisfy some of these concerns. On the Scottish ministers owning the pipes, I think I guess that would be kind of like what we had when we first started building electricity networks. It was a centralised system whereby the infrastructure was owned by the public sector in some way, and there has been a bit of talk about having municipal owned pipes and then allowing generators and suppliers to connect into that. I don't necessarily think that's a bad model as such, because I'm not a heat network developer, but I'm not sure that there's an appetite to go back to that kind of model.
I think the interesting thing,
it's Carol here. I haven't heard that very much discussed at all. I know it's out there as a concept, but the conversation around it doesn't seem to have been very well developed, and certainly I am not aware of a huge clamour for public ownership of the supporting infrastructure.
well, the Scottish National Investment Bank is effectively being set up to take at least a shared ownership of infrastructure, and that's to be encouraged, because if they've got a stake in the game, then they're going to encourage profitability, and they're going to encourage or at least viability and reasonable profitability, and that equals uptake. So I think the interesting question is, let's just assume that obligation to connect doesn't come about, and even if it did come about, just because you're connected doesn't mean you're consuming. So what do the folk dialing in think could be other ways that you could try and give some sort of certainty that somebody will feel compelled to buy heat from a new district heating network that might appear in a part of a city? How do we make the buildings, and I'm thinking commercial buildings rather than private homeowners, how do you make them want to buy heat from district heating?
Yes, I think that's exactly it. So, Carol, were you wanting to say something there?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say that the Scottish Government have said in terms that in the absence of an obligation to connect, they are really keen to look at ways of incentivising the connection. If it's incentivised, it's not an obligation, but certainly replacing the obligation with a strong incentivisation. But we're yet to see detail on what that looks like, and I think that's something which is ripe for discussion and ripe for some new suggestions.
Okay, so Catherine Cooper agrees with Dave. Public ownership would equal a wider buy-in. Oliver Lockhart asks, could there be minimum efficiency requirements for energy centres and ultimately the heat networks that could support the argument for compulsion? So that kind of taps into other things that are going on out there that will push people towards it, sort of in a implicit fashion.
Can I share an example on that? Our client in Norway and Drammen have two very, very strong. They're 50% owned by the city, first of all, which is interesting. But speaking to Kath's comment, and 50% owned by initially a utility, and then it was sold to an investment fund, and then sold back to the utility. They are absolutely obligated for the maximum allowable carbon footprint and air quality emissions from the network. So they're moving away from biomass, and they're moving away from gas and deploying heat pumps on their network. That's what they did 10 years ago, and reduced the carbon footprint by 80-odd%. So if they don't meet those carbon targets, they will lose their license. The second thing is they're not allowed to sell heat at a higher price than the prevailing electricity price in that zone. Now, being Norway, electricity is relatively cheap. It's about 6 or 7 pence per kilowatt hour, but they cannot sell heat higher than that. So the interesting thing, because they are a business, and I say it's owned by the city, it's a city pension fund, but essentially they're motivated to make the efficiency as high as possible, because they make the maximum amount of surplus that they can reinvest in the network and make the network bigger if they deploy a better heat pump rather than a poorer heat pump, for example. So the rules can be quite simple and yet quite effective. They had to reinvest in the network some 20 million euros to deploy the heat pumps and the new energy station, because they would have failed their air quality and their carbon targets. And then they were obligated, or sort of incentivized by pure market means to make it as best as possible for the maximum efficiency.
Okay. Any comeback there? Any other points from anyone else? We've got another point from Mark Patterson. Thank you. The question of compulsion is a double-edged sword. One that, on the one hand, you have central government policy, which has driven competition in the wider energy supply in this industry to ridiculous levels. And on the other, network developers who need guaranteed heat take to make the return on investment attractive. Compulsion is easier with public buildings, but with private owners, there has to be a financial incentive to connect. Should we not consider the carrot instead of always applying the stick in terms of fiscal incentives to connect? Any thoughts there?
I'll jump in.
The renewable heat incentive has existed since 2008 and offered about 2.5 times the cost of burning gas not to burn gas to non-domestic buildings. The uptake in that has been pretty much a flat line of zero. So I don't think carrots alone. I see carrots as the compensation for feeling the stick a little bit. We need the stick, but the carrot kind of softens the blow a little bit. You can't have it if there isn't.
I'd come in and entirely support Dave. The history of energy policy in the UK and Scotland in the last 10, 15, even 20 years is littered with examples of incentivized schemes under ECO and CES before it for the uptake of energy efficiency and low carbon measures. And anybody who's operated in that space has known that it's been a struggle to get the consumers to engage with it. So I think, going back to Sarah Jane's opening remarks, that the consumer awareness is partly part of the linchpin here, along with some stronger degree of obligation.
Any comments from Finn or Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, this really goes to the root of the issue, doesn't it? Which is that gas is heavily subsidised in the UK through tax breaks and tax incentives, the oil and gas industry, and we are, one of the cheapest gas rates in the whole of Europe as a consequence of that. And so to make anything compete with gas is highly challenging in the renewable heating and district heating sector. So I sort of think I don't know how that really gets balanced, because to change that scenario it is very challenging given the power of the oil and gas lobby groups. So the problem is that unless you have compulsion, as we're highlighting here, you're not going to have a district heating industry that with great ambition to retrofit district heating to our city. So do the government need to kind of just pay people to do it, or do businesses need to just pay? Effectively, we're not really paying the true cost of energy, when we're buying gas or electricity because of subsidisation. So I don't really know how that gets addressed, but it would be unfair that people on a heat network pay more because they're on a heat network. You could consider it that way, but how do you then address the subsidisation of gas?
Yeah, I'd support those comments, and also the comments from David and Carol about the carrot versus the stick. I mean, it's a good point that Mark makes. We probably do need to see a balance of these things, but as the RHI has highlighted, it just doesn't see that step change in growth that we're all focused on and all trying to achieve. And I think a lot of the discussion in the working groups building this bill and putting it together with the Scottish Government, it's about framing the carbon aspect as well. And I think ultimately a lot of the consumers and the way that the world's moving at the moment, there's a lot more of an educated consumer out there worried about what's going on and looking to make decisions based not solely on cost. There is obviously that key factor that's there, but how can we educate the consumer to look more at the carbon side of things? So it needs to be hand in hand with educating the consumer with the carbon content of their heat, beginning to compare it with other sources, and then starting to use those tools, the carrot and the stick tool, to frame the carbon question more effectively, so that decisions can be made based on not only the cost and what's easiest, but what's the best in order for us to meet these carbon targets, these carbon reduction targets that we're all going to have to meet. It's a real challenge that's been laid down by both governments north and south of the border, but it's facilitating consumers to actually see what the outcomes of their decisions are when we're talking about the carbon and the targets that we need to meet, and using the tools, both sticks and carrots, that will enable them to do that more effectively.
And just sort of continuing on that piece, Catherine Cooper asked me to pass on the question to you, Charlie. An SSE's position with respect to renewable requirements in London.
Can you repeat that? Sorry, Ben.
Right, yeah, it was to comment on the renewable requirements in London.
I'm not quite sure what specifics Catherine's going towards there. Is that with respect to the actual content of energy centres or heat? I mean, clearly there's some different drivers. Yeah, so there's clearly some different drivers in the London market. We have heat networks across the UK, and the drivers in the London market forced by the London plan have obviously facilitated a huge growth in heat networks, framed through the planning process, the building regulation, the planning process, in order to reduce the carbon content of buildings that are being developed. That is one way we could look at it, but the reality is, depending on which report you read, 80 to 90% of all buildings in existence at the moment are going to be in existence in 2050. So it's the retrofit piece that we really need to get a handle on, and we can start to put mechanisms in place to support developers of new sites of new developments and achieving low carbon content. That's the easy bit. I think a lot of us would be able to do that quite quickly, but it's how we achieve the decarbonisation of all the existing building stock that's the real challenge. And to go back to your point earlier, a few questions ago, Catherine, on the government owning the pipes, I think the challenge there is that no one here is saying that heat networks are meant to be everywhere. They're not right everywhere. They're absolutely not right everywhere. They're only right in the right places, and doing that socioeconomic modelling and looking at the demands and looking at what heat's available is fundamental to that. And it's not as simple as putting in the same piece of pipework into every large city, say in Scotland. There's a lot of work that needs to go on to design the sizes of the pipes that need to go in the ground to facilitate the types of temperatures that are needed for the demands. All those pieces, there's a lot of market growth that needs to happen and investment that needs to happen to get to a point where we're equivalent to electricity markets, where it's more of a kind of homogenous product. So yeah, I think there's real challenges around how you develop the market if you're not encouraging private sector investment into this space to make it grow.
I think there's one thing that I would add in there, just going back a little bit to the questions around competition and in the electricity sector. And I know this is probably stating the obvious, but I think it's worthwhile saying it. There is clearly, I think, a desire to have heat networks regulated in a similar way to electricity and gas, and to allow consumers similar choices. But I think there does need to be a bit of a step back and understand that these are two completely different things, and that the reason electricity suppliers can have so much competition is because those electricity suppliers are just sales companies, effectively. They don't have any infrastructure cost. The costs of infrastructure for electricity are either sunk for many years of public investment or are socialised. And that's not possible with a heat network in the same way. So there needs to be a recognition that what we're trying to regulate are two economically and structurally two different things, and so there might need to be different choices made in order to support the development of heat networks that aren't equivalent to the electricity sector, which is much more developed.
I would entirely support that, and I think partly if the industry itself is to share some of the blame, we have argued, myself amongst them, for level playing fields with traditional inverted commas utilities, and argued for a regulatory framework which supports that level playing field. And I think maybe that has obfuscated the message around what we're asking for, because it makes it sound like we see ourselves as part of the same energy delivery system that, for example, electricity companies are, and clearly we're not, and maybe it's muddied the waters a little bit.
There's a few comments here I'd like to put to you all. Just specifically on this point we were discussing just now, Catherine Cooper makes the point that electricity networks are monopolies. I don't know if you want to come back on that. Okay, so Chris Karras, thank you, says compulsion versus market-driven connections both depend on consumers either being offered competitively or required by regs to offer lower prices than gas heating. The same thing either way. The key question is how to de-risk the capital cost. And Eddie Boyd, thanks for your question, says zoning can be determined by local authorities on a high-level technical stroke economic basis. However, will not have any close cost awareness. Would there then be a risk that developers may not consider the areas viable? Could that render the area zoning redundant? Don't know if anyone wants to put in any.
Can I come in on? So I'd be quite like to say a few words on zoning. Zoning is a good thing, and Vattenfall is hugely supportive of the whole idea of zoning. But there are limitations to how useful and successful zoning can be, determined by the detail of the legislation. I think the problem which has been identified as by Ed, I think, is exactly right. I think one of the other problems is that, somewhat surprisingly in the bill, whilst local authorities or the Scottish Government can identify zones for heat networks in a local area, there is also a third provision which means that they don't have to bother. I mean, they do have to give an explanation to the Scottish Government why they haven't identified heat networks. And that comes back to the earlier comment about not all areas will be right for heat networks, but the fact that some local authorities will just choose not to because of resource issues or some other reason, I think is a shame. And within the zone areas, there's no timeline for identifying them. There's no timeline for granting the licenses. There's no timeline for granting of the permits within those zones either. So some of the time frames and details around zones has to be worked through in much more detail before we can really comment on how successful we're going to be in delivering the speed of heat network delivery that we want.
Ben, can I say something on Eddie's comment? A question that's going around my head, whether it's Inverness or Glasgow or Edinburgh, is what's the right number of zones to have in a city? When we look across the North Sea, we don't see multiple zones and multiple operators, as far as I'm aware, in the big cities. Maybe in the massive cities there might be, but it brings the question of what we've got to be very careful about doing. And I saw a presentation at Scottish Renewables once, I think it was Dundee, that had been modelled, and they were talking about cherry picking good zones and leaving the bad zones behind in the overall investability. And it kind of speaks a little bit to what Charlie was being asked about in London. You cannot have a situation where operators go in and pick out the best zone and leave the rest for later, because the rest for later becomes harder. So if they weren't prepared to do it at the beginning, they're less likely to do it if you've taken the cherry off the top of the cake. So for Inverness, for example, it reminds me of some work that the Scottish Government did in heat mapping. 80% of the heat demand in Scotland is within 1,000 metres of open water. So if you're within 1,000 metres of open water, surely and 80% is the sort of heat demand, surely the zones should be done around about proximity to heat source and electricity source to drive the solution. I think you get to the point fairly rapidly when you think about it, about making the zones as big as possible, almost citywide, to ensure that people don't pick out the good ones. But as well as being citywide, you probably end up with the zones being, a distance as a perimeter from the heat source, being rivers and the sea and so on. So I think it can work, but it's absolutely about surety of heat sales and surety of making a viable margin, and that comes down to all the things we've spoken about. But we still haven't really spoken about how do you make buildings feel inclined to buy heat from a heat network and feel comfortable doing it. You've got to get to a situation where they want to do it. That doesn't mean that it's cheaper, but you've got to make them want to do it. And let's put this in the context. 2030 for Edinburgh and Glasgow of net zero carbon, whatever that actually means. 2045 for Scotland. We've got 25 years at the most to reduce the consumption of gas in the buildings in the city centres. So that's a 4% drop every year as the minimum. If it's 2030, it's a 10% drop by minimum. So we've got to do something fairly direct, fairly radical, and get over these challenges. I accept there are challenges, the potholes in the road, banana skins, whatever you want to call them, but we've got to find a way of making people feel that they want to buy district heating if it turns up outside their door, because the alternative is worse. And somebody mentioned about Scandinavia and how that works earlier. They don't tend to have a cheap gas supply. In Drammen, they don't have a gas network, so the counterfactual is electricity. In Copenhagen, many of the buildings don't have a gas connection. So we're starting from the worst place possible of having really cheap gas. That's what Finian was talking about. And that's why high performance networks are so important. If you put in an average network that's got pretty poor efficiency and pretty poor consumption and not managing the buildings correctly, you get a higher cost of heat. So we've got to put in brilliant heat networks that are really well run, that are as big as possible to be the economies of scale, and therefore offer people the smallest gap between now and the future. But I have absolutely no doubt that commercial heat networks will be more expensive than cheap gas.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a number of other points here. I think what you just mentioned there, Dave, it addresses one of the questions that Oliver Lockhart asked, which is, could there be a minimum efficiency requirement for energy centres and ultimately the heat networks that could support the argument for compulsion? So talking about making sure you have a really high performance heat network, which I guess has to be part of the package. Also, Eddie Boyd mentioned, do you think that LHES is essential to have local authorities undertake a comprehensive district heating zoning duty? Excuse me.
On the LHES point, I think yes, and I actually think Scottish Government think yes as well, because the way the zoning provisions in the bill are structured at the moment are quite limited. They're very area focused, and I think the idea is that would be complemented by a local heat and energy efficiency strategy which is area wide, so local authorities looking across their whole patch to work out what they should be doing in various areas, and then the idea is that would then flow through into the zoning requirements under the bill, and they would pick certain heat network zones out of that. So I think the two do need to go hand in hand, otherwise you have quite a big gap on the duty of authorities to look wider than just a couple of areas. If I also pick up just on Dave's challenge on the incentivization, if you like, to connect, or the other big stick. So I don't think it's definitely not there yet, but to me it has to be around targets, requirements on buildings to reduce their carbon footprint, and that has to be around building standards, and it's more difficult for existing buildings. And I know that the policymakers are nervous, I think, about implementing very rigorous energy efficiency standards or carbon footprint standards on buildings that might have economic impacts, but I can't see any other way around the sort of incentivization to connect other than imposing duties or requirements on buildings to reduce their carbon footprint, which I presume would need to come through building regs. I can't think of any other obvious one at the moment.
Ben, can I ask a question of the other panelists?
Go for it.
I was struck the other day that the view across Glasgow is probably the clearest it's been in, I was going to say 100 years since we started burning coal for electricity and all the rest of it. It's probably, if you go back further, it's probably the clearest view we've had in terms of air quality across Glasgow for 400 years, maybe 500 years. If we are able to legislate for low emission zones in cities regarding transport, and it's interesting how much the NOx levels have fallen during the COVID-19 crisis, but they haven't fallen to zero because A, there's still some transport, but B, some of the NOx emissions are coming from burning gas for heating. particularly in the early part of COVID-19, it was relatively cold. It's much milder now. But if we're able to legislate an air quality for cars, could we legislate an air quality for buildings to make a building compelled to reduce its air quality emissions in step with the 2045 or 2030 targets? So a 10% reduction in NOx emissions for a building in the centre of Glasgow in 10 years, each year 10%. Is that possible with legislation?
I think that's an attractive idea, and I think I suppose part of it depends on the tenure of the building. I think it's easier to legislate in that way for public buildings and for social housing. I'm less clear about how that works with owner-occupied domestic dwellings, other than perhaps point of sale, or perhaps incentivized through the mortgage scheme for zero emissions.
So for non-domestic buildings, government were considering at point of sale or point of lease. So at the minute you want to change your tenant or you want to sell your building, then that's where the legislation would kick in. So I think it could potentially be the same for domestic, but I haven't considered the domestic point at all. I think it's harder for domestic. I think government will find it harder for domestic, but I don't think it should be that difficult for non-domestic.
But with commercial, and you pick up on exactly the tension between the tenant and the landlord. I mean, there's numerous buildings across Glasgow that don't even have LED light bulbs at the moment, and that's the easiest way of reducing your cost and carbon footprint. And that's because the tenant won't pay for them because they might move out, they might threaten to move out to get a better lease deal, and the landlord won't pay it well because they don't pay the electricity bill. But you know, how do you take the legislation and just make it work?
Yeah, sounds like there's work to be done on that one.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have I'm certainly not an air quality legislation expert, so I don't want to volunteer an opinion on yes, you could definitely do that. I mean, with legislation, you can pretty much do anything you like. It's just about whether the populace will accept it and whether you can get the policy through, particularly for Scottish Government on devolution and human rights issues. But I don't see why it would be impossible.
Nothing's
there was some
impossible. It's
discussion
just whether
about
it's politically expedient is a difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of question marks over a few of the finer details. And I think there was a bit of discussion about whether it could be linked into the LHES process as well, so the energy efficiency strategy process, which then would tie into the zoning. I think there are some challenges around how you actually implement it, though. It's definitely one of the tools that needs to be looked at, the air quality.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes before we've got to sort of shut up shop. So I'd like to move on to sort of just a few other questions. Just finally, with respect to the sort of the last point, Catherine Cooper just makes the point that we should separate the network assets from the buildings. The network consists of generation, transport, and supply. The investment criteria and risk factors for each are very different, and lumping them together gets very messy. So maybe that's an aspect to think as well. There's a few questions about the business model. John O'Shea asks if third-party access for prosumers on networks is seen as a key aspect of any district heat policy going forward, and if so, how is this currently being encouraged? And I just want to sort of package this together with another question from Chris Carris, another couple of questions from Chris Carris. Is the bill designed with a particular business model in mind or not? Energy utility versus selling energy service like an ESCO versus local authority owned? And does the bill allow for interconnection between networks for reasons of resilience or balancing supply and demand? So I guess there's a few points there, but it's about what sort of innovation or what sort of design of a business model is there, and what should there be?
Can I take the prosumer question?
So kick off Sarah Jane and then go Dave.
Okay, I will leave Dave with the prosumer question. I was just going to quickly respond on the network structures. The bill is largely agnostic, and it should be. The government are trying to be as flexible as possible. So I would encourage people to look at the definitions of heat network and consider whether there are things that would fall outside of it. And if there are things that would fall outside of it, then do get in touch. And they are trying to cover as many potential structures as possible. They're not forcing people down a particular route, although you would have to have a heat network. So heat as a service in terms of using somebody else's network, I don't think is really catered for particularly well at the moment. But as I say, the bill's quite agnostic, so there should be a certain degree of flexibility within it.
The prosumer thing, just to describe it, first of all, basically means people being able to sell heat into a network, and it immediately brings the question of what temperature the network's at, which immediately brings this somewhat murky area of ambient loops, as was mentioned, is probably not considered in the bill at the moment, and higher temperature loops. But I would take an example from some work we did over in Denmark. The site is selling heat into the district heating network, but it's not an ambient network. It's a network that's between 70 and 90 degrees, and yet they're still able to sell their waste heat. So taking an example, if it's the John O'Shea, I think it is in Dublin, we do all the cooling for Guinness in Dublin. They could very readily boost that waste heat up in temperature and sell it into the network. And that's a very eminently sensible and energy conservative sort of view of life, and they would get cooling in a way to reject heat without dumping it to air, and the challenges that come with cooling towers and all the rest of it, and evaporative condensers. But I think it comes back to my earlier point about keeping it simple, and when you have such a vast volume of ambient heat available to you from rivers and seas, adding the complexity of prosumers onto the network, when really it works at the largest possible scale. In the case of an ambient network, you can do it with smaller buildings that could be doing their cooling, but I think the climate that we live in isn't really and the sort of balance of heat demand and propensity for air conditioning and cooling is relatively light in terms of the cities and relatively short. And if there is quite a high use of it, it's probably wrong. We're sitting in offices that should have the window open and fresh air because it's 20 degrees outside, not the air conditioning switched on because that's the way the building was designed. So I think moving towards that just to try and create another market for it is probably creating a complexity that makes everything we've talked about even harder. And I suspect, although I haven't seen anybody study it in full, that ambient networks aren't really suited to sort of Northern European cities, although there are opportunities for cooling for sure. Building data centers in the right place, hospitals have high cooling demands typically, but I don't think we'll see prosumers emerging as the business model, because it's just a complexity that could be better solved. Yes, the sea or the Liffey or wherever river it is, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, wherever, it exists, and it's cheaper to take heat from an ambient available surface water source than having pockets of prosumers to try and make a network more viable. So it's a really interesting area, maybe one for a completely separate seminar, but I doubt it, is my honest opinion.
Listen, thank you very much for that, Dave. We're sort of coming up to the end of our time, and I know a couple of the panelists have sort of got to move on pretty quickly. There's a few more comments and questions, perhaps slightly more on the sort of specific side of things. What I'll do is I'll put those points together and ask the corresponding panelists to sort of perhaps comment, and I can get those points back to the questioner. But yeah, before we say thank you, any other final points from anyone on the panel? Starting with you, Carol.
Yeah, I think we've only touched on, which is another linchpin of the heat networks policy debate, and that's consumer protection and consumer rights, and particularly with COVID in mind, what happens to vulnerable consumers. I think that's probably an area for another webinar, because we could probably fill a whole hour and a half on that subject alone. But I think it's definitely something that people should be bearing in mind as we're developing the policy underpinning the legislation.
I think that the final point I would make is just that there's still lots to do, which means there's actually still quite a big opportunity to get involved and influence the detail that's yet to come. So I would encourage everyone to engage with it and to try and make sure that what comes out is what people want.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, thanks very much to everyone for attending. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every question. But yeah, thanks very much to you all, the panelists as well. I will just finish off. If you'd like to have more details, if you didn't get your question answered, please do get in touch with Sarah Jane. There's the email there for any specifics. And yeah, we would encourage you to sort of, if you want to send me sort of your broad thoughts on the compulsion point or any other point that we were looking at, please send them to me, and we will sort of collate them and share them as a group, so that hopefully that could help inform our response. Okay, so we'll finish off the session with the next poll. Here comes the next question, which of course is the same as how we started, but let's just see how we all feel about the Heat Networks bill now and how it could de-risk investment. If you could just answer that, that would be great. Okay. Okay, I'll give another few seconds and we'll see what the results were. Okay. There we are. So, yeah, okay, I think we've managed to convince, we've taken a little bit of this uncertainty out of this, and it's transferred to a bit more people thinking that with this bill needs some work. We started off with 15% yes, and now we've got 13%, 11% no, and now we have 25%, and uncertain was 74% and 63%. So there's a little bit less uncertainty. Once again, thanks very much for you all for joining us.